After I said I couldn't watch the kids over the weekend because I had a follow-up doctor's appointment, my daughter-in-law said over the phone, "Oh, okay, I guess you're just not interested in supporting this family." I didn't even get a chance to answer before she hung up. Minutes later, I got a text from my son. "Mom, don't come to the house anymore. It's time to set some boundaries." We changed the locks. A week later, I was standing in front of their house with a stranger by my side. "I'm glad you're here. Stay until the end and tell me what city you're watching my story from. I want to know how far it has reached." The path to Edward's house, my son, was so familiar, I knew every stone. I walked it hundreds of times, bringing food, clothes, or just to play with my grandchildren. I was the one who made the down payment on that house with my life savings from working at a shoe shop. And now there I was in front of the gate, my hand trembling as I rang the doorbell. No one answered. I took the old key from my pocket, tried to open the door, but it wouldn't go in. Yes, they had changed it. Just yesterday, while I was folding laundry, the phone vibrated loudly on the kitchen shelf, startling me. The screen showed the name Laura, my daughter-in-law. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered with that old cell phone Edward had bought me years ago. "Mom, are you free this weekend?" Laura said in that fast, sharp voice of hers. "We need you to watch Isabella and Nick. Edward has a night shift at the hospital, and I have a work event at a resort. It's for the whole Sunday, okay?" I hesitated. I gripped the edge of the table tightly. My knee has been killing me these last few weeks. Every step is like a needle in the bone. The doctor had scheduled me last month, and I had already postponed twice because of favors for Laura. This time, he was clear. "Mrs. Olivia, if you don't come in now, your knee could be seriously damaged." I took a deep breath and tried to speak softly. "Oh, honey, I have a doctor's appointment this weekend. It's my knee checkup. The doctor said it can't be put off any longer." Silence. A long, uncomfortable one. I could hear Laura's breathing on the other end. Her voice got lower, not out of concern, but with a tone that chilled my blood. "Oh, so Mom's health is more important than her son's family, is that it?" I was stunned, as if I had been slapped. "What are you talking about, Laura?" I tried to explain, my voice trembling. "I've already postponed twice, and it really hurts now. I can't stand for long." She sighed, that sigh loaded with mockery that I've heard so many times. "Fine, Mom. I guess you never really wanted to help us. You always say you love the kids, but when we need you, you disappear." I opened my mouth to reply. "What are you talking about, Laura? But I didn't finish. The line went dead. That dial tone was like a door slamming in my face. I stood there, phone still in my hand, my heart in pieces. Laura has never been easy, but this was like a direct stab. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was stressed, that it was all a misunderstanding. But 2 hours later, Edward's message took my breath away. "Mom, don't come to the house anymore. It's time to set some boundaries. We changed the locks." I read the message over and over as if it wasn't real. Did Edward, the son I raised, really send this? My only son? I dialed his number. Once, twice, 3 times. No one answered. On the 4th try, a recording said, "The number you have dialed is not available." I felt my blood run cold. My knees ached, but I didn't even care anymore. I put on a sweater, grabbed my purse, and went straight to their house. I knocked on the door gently at first, then harder. "Laura, Edward, open the door for your mother," I shouted, my voice hoarse from the cold afternoon air. The curtain on the 2nd floor moved slightly. I saw a shadow pass, and then the curtain was pulled shut. My heart was beating so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then the front door opened. Laura came out, stood on the porch with her arms crossed, and looked me up and down. She laughed with that smile that made me feel small. "Do you really think you can just show up whenever you want? This isn't your house anymore." It was hard to speak, but I tried to stay calm. "I just want to explain. I never said I didn't love the children." Laura cut me off with a tone as sharp as a knife. "Didn't love them? You didn't say it, but you always avoid them. You always have an excuse not to be here." Just then, Edward appeared behind her arms, crossed, looking at me with a tired expression. He said nothing. He just stood there as if agreeing with everything she said. I tried one more time, my voice breaking. "You both know everything I've done for this family." Edward finally spoke, his voice cold, emotionless. Mom, do you really think that helping us with a few dollars gives you the right to meddle in everything? We're tired of it. You should worry about your own life. That sentence hit me like a hammer. A few dollars, I secured this house with over $20,000, not to mention what I paid for the roof repairs, Isabella's preschool, and Nick's insurance. Every month I send them something so they don't drown in expenses. And now that's just a few dollars, I wanted to scream. I wanted to list every penny, every day I broke my back for them. But the words wouldn't come out. Laura went back inside and slammed the door. The sound of the deadbolt was like a final judgment. I stood there looking at the steps. The basket I had brought 2 days ago was still there, some oatmeal cookies I made for Isabella, a jar of honey I had warmed up that morning for Nick. All of it was covered in ants, as if nobody cared. I picked it up with trembling hands, then put it back down. There was no point anymore. I walked away, dragging my feet down the street I once knew so well. My knees hurt, but my chest hurt more. No one looked at me. No one asked anything. I just heard one phrase in my head over and over like a bell. Just for saying, no one time I was kicked out of the family I gave everything for. I got home after dark. The room was silent, only the ceiling fan whirring. I sat in the chair and hugged my knees. The box of medicine the doctor gave me was there untouched. I looked at it, then out the window where the light from the street lamp barely came in. I felt empty, but there was still a spark of hope, that it was all a misunderstanding, that Edward would call, that Laura would apologize. But the phone remained silent, and I understood that everything had changed, just because I had dared to say no. It's been a week since Edward's cold message, and I'm still not used to the feeling of being cut off from my own family. My house is completely silent now without the noise of children or those rushed calls from Laura asking me to watch the kids. But I couldn't just sit here hugging the pain and filling myself with unanswered questions. I decided to go back to Edward and Laura's house, the same one I made the down payment on with a lifetime of sweat. This time, I didn't go alone. The man with me was in his 50s, thin, with a faded but well-ironed shirt. He wore dark glasses that hid his eyes, though I imagined he had seen a lot in his life. In his hand he carried an old leather briefcase, its corners worn the kind used for important papers. I had met him 2 days earlier through an acquaintance in the neighborhood. He didn't talk much, just nodded when I briefly told him my story, and then asked, "Do you want me to come with you?" I accepted, not because I trusted him, but because I didn't know who else to turn to. The way to Edward's house was familiar, but today every step felt heavier. My knees still hurt, but I made the effort, gripping my purse tightly. When we arrived, I stopped in front of the iron gate, looking at the house I once considered my second home. The green paint on the gate was already worn with rusty spots showing through. On the stairs were Isabella's little sandals, one of them overturned, as if someone had left them in a hurry. I rang the doorbell. It buzzed dryly, but no one came out. I rang again, and then a third time. Nothing. From a second-floor window, I saw the curtain move slightly. Someone peeked out for a few seconds, then closed it again. I knew someone was inside, but they didn't want to see me. The man beside me said nothing. He just cleared his throat, opened his briefcase, and took out a carefully sealed brown envelope. "If they don't open up, leave this there," he said in a low, firm voice, as if it was something he did every day. I took the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't really know what was inside, only that he had prepared it based on what I asked for the day before. I went up the steps and left it right next to Isabella's sandals. A gust of wind moved the corner of the envelope a little. As I turned, I saw Laura standing in the living room, arms crossed, watching me through the frosted glass. Her gaze was cold, showing no emotion. There was no sign of Edward. Maybe he was at the hospital, or maybe he just didn't want to face me. When I turned to leave, the man followed me with steady steps. When we reached the car parked at the corner, he stopped, took off his dark glasses, revealing tired but very sharp eyes. He asked me, his voice soft but firm, "Are you sure you want to see this through to the end?" I stood still, looking at my worn-out shoes. I didn't know exactly what seeing it through to the end meant. A lawsuit, getting back what I gave, or simply not letting them treat me like I was worthless anymore. "I'm not sure," I replied, my voice low but firm, "but I do know that I don't want to put up with this anymore." He nodded without another word and opened the car door for me. Instead of going straight home, I asked him to drive by the pharmacy where I usually buy my knee pain pills. I got out, but I didn't go in. I stood in front of a shop that had been closed for years. The Tree Shoe Shop. The wooden sign was worn, and of the name you could barely read half of it. I worked there for 20 years, ever since Edward was a little boy running around barefoot. That's where it all started, with a pair of torn shoes and a promise I never asked to be returned. But now, standing in front of that closed shoe shop, I understood that promise was what turned me into a shadow in my own family. I gave everything, money, strength, time, only to end up with a new lock and a closed door. The man stood a few steps behind me, not rushing me, just waiting in silence. I don't really know who he is. An acquaintance recommended him, saying he could help, but I never asked his name or what he planned to do with that envelope. I just know that when I told him how they kicked me out of Edward's house, he didn't comfort me or give me advice. He just said, "Tell me what papers you need and I'll get them for you." I got back in the car and sat in the back seat. He started the engine, but didn't ask where I wanted to go. I looked out the window, watching the familiar streets go by. "Has your family ever turned their back on you?" I blurted out. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror and half smiled. "Whose hasn't, Mrs. Olivia?" It was a short answer, but it was enough to make me feel like he understood at least a little. When we arrived, I opened the door and went into my small room. On the table, the box of oatmeal cookies I had made for Isabella was still there, untouched. I sat down and opened the envelope the man had given me before he left. Inside was a sheet with a few lines. "Down payment contract copy, bank transfer original. If you need more, call me." Below was a name, Vincent Morales, and a phone number. I held the paper with trembling hands. It was the first time I knew his name, but I still didn't understand who he was or why he was helping someone like me. I left the paper on the table and looked out the window. The streetlight cast a dim glow, and Laura's face in the living room came to mind, looking at me as if I were a stranger. I wondered if the envelope on the step would have made her change her mind, or if it just made her angrier. But what bothered me most was Vincent's question. "Are you sure you want to see this through to the end?" I didn't know. I only knew that for the first time in many years I was facing a decision not for Edward, not for Laura, but for myself. That night, I sat in the old wooden chair in my room, the yellow light illuminating a worn-out notebook. Outside, the sky was quiet. The only sound was the constant whir of the ceiling fan. After the visit to Edward's house, I didn't even want to turn on my phone, because every time I did, I only found silence from my son and daughter-in-law. Instead, I opened the notebook and flipped through the pages as if trying to reclaim the years I had dedicated entirely to that family. Every word written, every number, there was a piece of my life that I gave away, but now they were just blurry ink stains that no one remembers. I remember the day Edward, at just 12 years old, came running home with his sneakers torn at the toe. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy, and he told me that kids at school had made fun of him for wearing old shoes. I hugged him, dried his tears, but inside I felt shattered. Back then, my salary at the Tree Shoe Shop barely covered food and rent. I didn't have a single extra dollar for new sneakers. But seeing him like that, I couldn't just stand by. I went to the shop, got on my knees in front of the owner, and begged for an advance. He looked at me, shook his head, and said flatly, "Asking for money again. You can't even save up for a pair of shoes." I gritted my teeth, lowered my head, took the money, and ran to the market to buy him the blue sneakers Edward loved so much. When I gave them to him, his smile lit up my soul. He hugged me tight and said, "Mom, you're the best in the world." In that moment, I felt it was all worth it. But now when I remember the cold look Edward gave me at the door last week, I wonder what happened to that boy. When he went to college, he studied in a city more than 3 hours away by bus. Every month I sent him money, even if it meant working extra hours at the shoe shop and cleaning offices at night. I had 2 jobs. By day I sold shoes. By night I swept and mopped. Sometimes I'd get home at midnight, my feet aching, but I'd still sit down to cook food to send to Edward. Sometimes corn tamales, sometimes orange marmalade that I'd started cooking early in the morning. I just wanted him to study in peace without worrying about anything. In his final semester, he called me in a panic. "Mom, I need a good chunk of money for my final project." If I don't turn it in, they won't let me graduate. I asked him how much he needed. He told me an amount that left me speechless. $5,000. I didn't have that kind of money, but I couldn't let my son fail. I ran to the ladies on the neighborhood committee and took out a high-interest loan which I paid off weekly for 6 months. Every week, I counted every dollar. I cut back on food, electricity, everything to pay off the debt. Edward graduated, and I cried seeing him in his cap and gown smiling on stage, but he never knew that by that day his mother was already half broken from so much work and debt. After graduating, Edward started dating Laura. From the first time I saw her, I knew something wasn't right. She shook my hand limply and looked at me as if she were scanning my wrinkles. I wore my nicest blouse and smiled, but Laura just nodded and whispered something to Edward. I managed to hear the word hick. Since I saw he was smitten with her, I kept quiet. I brought out a homemade flan to share, trying to break the ice. Laura looked at it and said, "Homemade? It looks simple, doesn't it?" I laughed nervously and said, "Yes, I've been making it for Edward since he was a boy. He loves it." She said nothing, just nodded again and looked away. For their wedding, I took out everything I had saved for 10 years, over $15,000, so Edward could have a nice party. I wanted him to have a great day, but Laura wasn't satisfied. One day, I overheard Edward telling a friend, "Laura says my mom should pay for the dress too, that she hasn't helped with anything." I froze. Nothing I had paid for almost everything. The catering, the venue, the music. Still, I swallowed my anger and went out to get another $1,000 for Laura's dress. When she came out wearing it all, I hoped for was a thank you. But she looked at me and said, "Thanks, but next time pick a lighter shade. This one is too dull." When Edward lost his job, I told them to come live in my apartment. It was small, just 1 bedroom, but I gave it to them. I slept on a cot in the living room with back pain for 4 straight months. Laura cooked twice. The rest fell to me. Cooking, cleaning, ironing, taking Isabella to preschool. There were days I'd get up at 5 in the morning to make porridge for the little girl, and then I'd go to the shoe shop. Laura would just say, "It's a good thing you can help us. We're very busy." I would just nod, believing I was supporting my son through a tough time. When they said they wanted to move out on their own, I didn't hesitate. I sold the piece of land I inherited out in the country, the one my parents had left me to make the down payment on the house where they live now. I put the property in Edward's name, thinking that with their own house, they would settle down and not always depend on me. The day they signed the papers, I stood outside the notary's office watching Edward and Laura laugh together, and I felt a sense of relief. But no one turned to ask, "Mom, are you okay?" Tonight, I opened my notebook from 2021. On the first page, it said, "Send another $200 to fix the gas stove at Edward's house." I had noted every expense in detail. The roof after the hurricane, Isabella's preschool, Nick's vaccinations. Each note with its receipt neatly taped in, not to claim anything, but out of habit for someone who has lived her whole life counting every dollar. I reached the last page and read the last line. "Birthday gift for Isabella, $100. I stopped thinking. When was the last time they asked me, "Mom, do you need anything?" I can't remember. I closed the notebook and left it on the table. The room was silent. Only the ticking of the clock could be heard. I looked out the window where the dim light from the street lamp barely shone. My years of sacrifice, so many days breaking my back, every hard-earned dollar. All of it was now just lines in an old notebook. Edward and Laura don't remember. They only remember the day I said no. I clutched the notebook in my hands as if I wanted to hold on to some part of the years that are gone. But deep down, I know that everything I gave, no one kept. The next morning after leaving the envelope at the door of Edward's house, I woke up early, but not because I had anything to do. This little house where I live now is so quiet. Only the wall clock marks the seconds. I made myself a coffee. I sat at the kitchen table stroking the notebook where I keep the accounts for Edward's family. But today, I didn't open it. I just looked out the window where the morning light filtered through the branches, trying to understand everything that's happening. I know that even if no one says it, they have removed me from my son and daughter-in-law's life. The phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Mary, Edward's neighbor, who I got along with since I started bringing them bread. It said, "Olivia, I don't want to get involved, but Laura told the neighborhood group that her mother-in-law is getting old, can't control her emotions, and likes to meddle where she's not wanted. I read the message and gripped my coffee cup. Laura didn't just shut the door in my face, now she's telling the whole neighborhood I'm a nosy, out-of-control old woman. I replied with a short thanks, but inside I wanted to scream that I am not that person. I decided to go out. I couldn't stay locked up with those words spinning in my head. I walked to the corner supermarket where I used to buy food for Isabella and Nick. As soon as I walked in, I saw Isabella with a woman I didn't know. I assumed she was the new nanny. The little girl was wearing the coat I gave her for her birthday, but her eyes no longer had the same sparkle. I moved closer to call her name, but the woman stepped in front of me and said coldly, "Ma'am's instructions. No strangers are allowed to approach." Strangers. I froze. I looked at Isabella. She looked up. Our eyes met for a few seconds, and then she turned away as if she didn't know me. I stood there in the middle of aisles full of people feeling like a ghost. When I got home, I opened the refrigerator. Last week's food was still untouched. No one had eaten with me. On the table was still the box with the birthday gift I had prepared for Nick, a wooden puzzle I had carefully chosen at the market. There it was dusty because I hadn't had the chance to give it to him. I picked up the phone and called Edward, hoping he would at least answer. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I sent him a message. "I left a piece of the cake you like. If you want, you can stop by for it." I waited for an hour, but there was no reply. In the afternoon, I went to the old church at the end of the street where I used to go to Mass every Sunday. I sat in the last pew, silently watching the light filter through the stained glass windows and fall onto the floor. A young woman, maybe a catechism teacher, approached me and asked in a low voice, "Are you the lady who was kicked out of her house?" I heard about it from Laura at the group meeting. I just nodded, not wanting to explain myself. What Laura said had already spread everywhere like a stain dirtying all those years I had given my all. I left the church, walking under the evening light with a heavy heart. That night I sat at the table and took out an old notebook. I started to write down every expense I had made for Edward's family. The down payment for the house, $20,000. The roof repair after the storm, $1,500. Isabella's preschool, $3,000 a year. Nick's vaccines and health insurance, over $1,000. In total, nearly $45,000 in 6 years. I wrote down each figure with a trembling hand, not because of the money, but because I realized that all of it today fits into a single sentence from Edward. A few dollars. I put the pages in a large envelope and wrote on the front what I once gave. I didn't plan on giving it to anyone. I just wanted to keep it as proof that I was once there in their lives. I remembered what Vincent had told me the other day. "Are you sure you want to see this through to the end?" At the time I didn't fully understand what he meant, but now I'm starting to feel it. This isn't just about money. It's about whether I have value as a person or not. The years I worked until I had no strength left. The times I gave up my room. The gifts I lovingly prepared for my grandchildren. They can't be reduced to a shadow that Laura and Edward can so easily erase. I stood up, opened the closet, and took out the sweater I used to wear when I took care of Isabella and Nick. It was old, worn at the shoulders, but Nick used to sleep in my arms in that sweater, and I took Isabella to the park in it. I folded it and put it in a corner of the closet as if folding a part of my life. I didn't cry, but my eyes burned. I knew in that moment that I couldn't continue living like a ghost in my own family. Vincent, that reserved man, showed me a light, not hope, but an option. I still don't know what I'll do with the envelope he left at the door, but for the first time in years, I felt the urge to stand up, not for anyone else, but for myself. I lay down on the bed. The light from the street lamp filtered through the curtain and reflected on the ceiling. I thought of Isabella and Nick, of the little girl's eyes in the supermarket today. I told myself that even if Edward and Laura see me as a stranger, I am still their grandmother. And I'm not going to let them erase me, not for a single time. I said no. A week later, I pushed open the door to the small office of Vincent Morales, the man who had accompanied me when I left the envelope at the entrance of Edward's house. The metal sign outside was already faded. You could barely read Morales and Associates Legal Services. Inside it smelled of old paper and cold coffee, and the ceiling fan made a noise as if it were telling stories no one wanted to hear. I stood there clutching the handles of my purse, feeling like I was stepping onto a path I never imagined I would take. Vincent stood up from his scratched wooden desk and pulled a chair out for me. He was wearing a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking more like a lifelong friend than a guy who deals with paperwork. "Mrs. Olivia," he said in a deep, slow voice, "I imagine you've made a decision, right?" I nodded, sat down, but kept clutching my purse. I wasn't sure what exactly I had decided. I just knew I couldn't keep letting Edward and Laura treat me as if I didn't exist. I asked him in a soft but firm voice, "The other day, the envelope you gave me, did it have everything necessary?" Vincent nodded without even checking anything, as if he had it all memorized. "It had a copy of the down payment contract for the house, with an additional clause, the proof of bank transfers in your name," he said, then paused for a moment, "and the handwritten letter you wrote." I fell silent, a lump in my throat. I wrote that letter one sleepless night after coming back from Edward's house. I sat under the dim light and wrote it line by line, not to complain, but to remind myself of everything I had given. When I finished, I gave it to Vincent to leave with the papers. I don't know if Edward or Laura read it, but I needed to do it. Vincent looked at me, his eyes behind his thick glasses, showing something like empathy. "They haven't responded," he said, "but I believe they read it. Sooner or later they will. That letter was the first sign for them to understand that you're not going to stay silent anymore." He paused and then asked, "Do you want to sue them to recover your assets?" I immediately shook my head. "I don't want to sue," I replied with a firmness that surprised me. "I just don't want them to go on living as if I never contributed anything." Vincent nodded without giving an opinion, took a stack of papers from his drawer and began taking notes. I asked him to help me draft some important documents. First, the cancellation of the power of attorney I had given to Edward 3 years ago, when I thought he needed support to get on his feet. Next, a request to stop all automatic transfers from my account to the accounts related to their house, the money I sent every month for repairs, utility payments, or things for Isabella and Nick. Finally, I wanted to create a new will. I told Vincent, my voice trembling slightly. "The majority of what I have, the house I live in, my savings account, and some jewelry. I want it to go to the House of Light Foundation, which supports abandoned women or victims of domestic violence. A small portion I want to be a scholarship for Isabella and Nick, but only if they come looking for me from the heart." Vincent wrote quickly with a firm hand without asking questions. When he finished, he pushed the papers towards me and said, "I know a young lawyer who collaborates with the House of Light. If you'd like, I can introduce you." I nodded, and I felt as if a weight had finally been lifted. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like silence was dictating my life. Vincent didn't judge me, he didn't comfort me. He just worked with the certainty of someone who has seen too many stories. I don't know much about him, only that he was a friend of someone in the neighborhood, and that now he does this to help people like me, people who have been cast aside by their own family. I left the office as it was getting dark. On the way home, I stopped by the market to buy some vegetables, but I couldn't stop thinking about the letter inside the envelope. What had I written that I had given my entire life, from the down payment on the house to the sleepless nights worrying about Edward? That I didn't want anything back, but I did want them to know that I am not invisible. I don't know if Laura or Edward read it, but just them having held it in their hands made me feel like I had reclaimed a part of myself. When I got home, I opened the closet and took out the old clothes I used to wear when I took care of Isabella and Nick. The sweater with the worn shoulders, the apron I wore for cooking, the sneakers with the smooth soles from so many trips to drop Isabella off at school. I folded them. I put them in large bags and sealed them with tape with a label that said, "No longer for invisible sacrifices." I didn't throw them away. I just stored them in a corner like someone putting away a part of their life. I stood in front of the mirror looking at my wrinkled face. My knees still hurt, but I felt lighter. Not because I had won anything, but because I was finally starting to stand up to not let the silence of Edward and Laura crush me anymore. I sat at the table, took out a small piece of paper, and wrote, "Thank you, Vincent. I don't know if I'll send it or not, but I needed to write it as a reminder that I'm not alone. He, with his worn-out briefcase and his deep voice, made me see that I still have the right to choose. I put the paper in my pocket, turned off the light, and went to bed. That night I slept better, even if just for a little while, because I knew I was now walking my own path, not someone else's. 3 days after leaving the envelope at the entrance of Edward's house, the phone vibrated on the kitchen table. I looked at the screen. It was Edward. I felt a small flutter in my chest, not from hope, but because I was ready for this call. I answered with a calm voice. "Hello?" Edward's voice sounded softer than I remembered, as if he wanted to fix things. "How are you, Mom? We haven't talked in a while. You've become very cold." I was silent for a few seconds, gripping the cup of now cold coffee. "I'm fine," I said, not letting emotion pull me in. Edward continued, his voice somewhat hesitant. "I think the bank notified us this week that an insurance payment was canceled. Did you make a mistake? I think it was the system." I interrupted him, firm but serene. "No, it was me, on purpose." There was a long silence on the other end. I heard his breathing, and then his voice became more tense, as if trying not to lose control. "You can't do this over something so small. Family is family, not a legal contract." I pressed my lips together, looking out the window where the morning sun filtered through the branches. "When they treat me like a stranger," I said calmly, "I also have the right to act like a stranger." Without waiting for a response, I hung up. I placed my hand on the table where the volunteer application for the House of Light Foundation still lay. I had sent my application to the House of Light right after meeting Vincent Morales. I didn't want to keep sitting in this little house, letting the silence from Edward and Laura continue to suffocate me. That Monday I went to the center for the first time. The House of Light was an old building with faded white walls, but full of life inside. They put me in charge of teaching reading and writing to a group of women. Almost all of them had never set foot in a school. They sat around a wooden table holding their pencils awkwardly, but their eyes shone every time they managed to write their own name. I taught them how to spell, patiently correcting each shaky letter. A woman about my age took my hand after class and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Olivia. I was finally able to write my daughter's name." I smiled at her, but I felt a lump in my chest. I had also taught Isabella how to write, but now she doesn't even call me Grandma. Every Monday and Thursday afternoon, I went to the House of Light. Besides teaching, I helped prepare food with the group. We made corn cakes, cooked beans, chopped vegetables while laughing and chatting. One day I read a thank you letter from a 16-year-old girl who had been forced to marry at 13. She wrote, "The sister at the House of Light told me I could learn a trade that I could live on my own. I never believed I was worth that much." I folded the letter and put it in my purse, my chest filled with warmth. I realized I no longer needed to hear children's voices or be called Grandma every night to feel like I was worth something. I didn't want to be that person they only look for when they need free help. One night I came home late, my feet sore after a whole day at the center. I opened the fridge, took out the milk carton, and sat at the kitchen table. The yellow light illuminated the calendar hanging on the wall. Isabella's birthday was almost here, just a few days away. I remembered she loved to draw, that she liked brightly colored cards. I took out my old watercolor set and started making one for her. I drew a little house with trees around it and an older woman smiling at the door. Below I wrote, "Your grandma has never forgotten you. She just learned to remember you without asking for permission." I folded the card, put it in an envelope, but I didn't send it. I wanted to keep it as a reminder that I still love my grandchildren, but in my own way. The following days I continued going to the House of Light. I was getting used to the new faces, Mrs. Maria, who taught me how to make mole properly, young Anna, who told me how her husband kicked her out for asking for money for their son's medicine. Each story was a scar, but also a small light because they were all moving forward just like me. I no longer checked my phone every hour waiting for a message from Edward. I no longer opened my notebook to count the money I had given. I just wanted to live, truly live for myself. One Thursday afternoon after teaching, I stayed for tea with Mrs. Helen, the center's director. She handed me some papers for the scholarship fund that I had asked Vincent to set up for Isabella and Nick. Mrs. Olivia, she said, you're doing this because you love your grandchildren, right? But you're also doing it for yourself. And I nodded without saying anything, but I felt as if a weight had been lifted off me. She was right. I wasn't just taking care of the love I feel for my grandchildren, I was also rescuing myself. That night I came home, opened the window to let the fresh air in, took out the card I painted for Isabella, and looked at it again. I don't know if she'll ever receive it, but I understood that I no longer need anyone's permission to love. I put it away in the drawer next to the letter I wrote to Edward and Laura. I sat by the window watching the night sky. I am no longer the shadow in their family. I am Olivia, the one who is learning to stand on her own, even if her knees ache, even if her soul still has wounds. And for the first time I felt like I was living, not just surviving. On Saturday morning I woke up early, made a cup of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Only the ticking of the clock and the sunlight filtering through the curtains could be heard. As I was arranging some potted plants on the porch, I heard a noise in the mailbox. I went out to check, and there was a white envelope with no stamp or address. The round handwriting on the front was Laura's. I took it with a trembling hand, but I didn't open it right away. I went back inside, left it on the table, and sat staring at it as if it would speak for my daughter-in-law. Finally, I tore open the envelope and took out the letter. Laura's handwriting was firm. Each word hurt like a knife. You are destroying the family. That's not what a mother should do. We've tried to understand, but you're not cooperating. We're not going to beg, but don't complain later if there's nothing left to save. I read and reread it, looking for any trace of remorse, an apology, or even a little bit of responsibility. But there was nothing, only cold phrases, as if I were the one who ruined everything, as if all the years I sacrificed weren't worth a single mention. I folded the letter, left it on the table, and opened the window. A cool breeze came in, but inside I still felt heavy. That afternoon, while cleaning the table, I heard shouting at the gate. "Mom, open up!" It was Edward's voice, angry, but with a desperate tone. I went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and saw him standing in front of the gate, wearing an old t-shirt, his hair a mess, and banging on the metal nonstop. "I'm your son. How can you treat me like this, just because Laura said something you didn't like?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel pity, just exhaustion. Edward, the boy I held in my arms, the one I bought shoes for with borrowed money, was there like a stranger blaming me for what he and his wife had done. I didn't open the door. I didn't respond. I closed the curtain, heard a few more shouts, and then the sound of his motorcycle driving away. I sat in the chair, hugging my aching knees. I wasn't angry, and I didn't cry. I just knew that the bond between Edward and me had broken, and I didn't want to mend it. There are some things that, when broken, are better left that way. That night, I put on a sweater, grabbed my purse, and walked to the bank. I already had an appointment to transfer my main savings account, over $25,000, saved throughout my entire life, to the House of Light Fund. The young bank teller looked at me surprised. "Are you sure that's no small amount?" I nodded calmly. I gave my life to those who didn't deserve it. Now I want to choose wisely. She nodded, printed the papers, and I signed. I kept a small portion for myself, just enough to live comfortably, and I opened a new account in the names of Isabella and Nick, just in case. I want my grandchildren to have something, but only if they decide to look for me, not because I force them. On the way home, I passed by the corner bookstore. The shop was small, smelling of old paper and wood. I chose a hardcover notebook, brown, simple but sturdy, and a fountain pen. The girl at the shop smiled. "Are you going to write a diary?" I nodded without saying more. When I got home, I sat at the table, opened the notebook, and wrote the first line. "Every time I say no, I am saving what's left of me." I wrote each word slowly as a reminder. I am no longer the mother or grandmother who only gives without receiving. I am Olivia, and I have the right to live for myself. Checking the mail before bed, I saw a flyer from the House of Light that said, "Women were not born to serve in gratitude." I took it, read it over and over, and then pinned it to the corkboard next to my bed. The old family photo, me, Edward, Laura, and the kids, I had taken it down last month. I didn't need it anymore. That flyer, with its simple but powerful phrase, was enough to remind me that I was on the right path. The next morning, I went back to the House of Light. I helped Mrs. Helen organize the paperwork for some new women who had arrived at the center. A young woman, Rose, told us that her husband's family threw her out of the house because she refused to hand over her entire salary. I listened to her, nodded, and told her about the literacy group I'm leading. Rose smiled and told me, "Mrs. Olivia, you make me want to try again." I smiled back, my heart feeling lighter. Here I not only help them, but I'm also finding myself a woman no longer defined by invisible sacrifices. That afternoon when I got home, I took my watercolor set out of the closet. I painted another card for Isabella, although I still didn't know how I would get it to her. This time I painted a field full of daisies with an old woman standing in the middle, holding a balloon. I wrote, "I'll be here in case you want to find me one day." I folded the card and put it in the drawer next to the previous one. I was in no hurry to send it, but I knew I would when the time was right. I stood up, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The wind came in smelling of freshly cut grass. I no longer wait for the phone to ring. I no longer check for messages from Edward or Laura. I cut that broken tie, and for the first time I felt free, not because I had stopped loving my family, but because I learned to love myself. It's been a year since I last hung up the phone on Edward, since I decided to break the frayed thread that connected me to his family. I spent that first winter alone, truly alone. No calls, no children's laughter, no parties filled with cake and joy. My little house was silent, but it no longer felt heavy. I found a new rhythm, a part of myself that Edward and Laura had buried. I still go to the House of Light every week. It's a habit now. I teach women who have never held a pencil how to read. I clean the storage room full of donated clothes, and I help fill out applications for those who need it most. Once I sat with Mrs. Helen to fill out a form for a young woman named Sarah. Her stepfather had kicked her out of the house after she dared to call the police on him for abuse. I wrote down each detail. As Sarah spoke, her voice trembling, but with great firmness. When she said, "I want to learn to sew so I don't have to ask anyone for money anymore," I smiled at her and handed her a sheet of paper with a pen. I told her, "Write your name. Start from there." Seeing her eyes light up, I saw myself reflected in her, someone who was once ignored, but is now learning to stand on her own. One Friday afternoon, I was watering the potted daisies on the porch. The water fell gently onto the soil. It was cold, but I liked the feeling. It kept me awake. I heard a knock on the door, soft but insistent knocks. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened it. There stood Edward, thinner than I remembered, with a grown-out beard and sunken eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. He was holding Nick in his arms, wrapped in a thin blanket, sleeping soundly. Beside him was Isabella, with a crumpled plastic bag, and her eyes wide as if she was holding back tears. I looked at them, said nothing, just felt a twinge in my knee. Edward spoke quietly, his voice raspy. "Laura left. She left the kids. I'm jobless. I owe over $2,000 in rent and utilities. I don't know where to take them." I stood still, looking at his face. He was no longer the boy I bought shoes for or sent money to for college. He was an exhausted man cornered by life. I said nothing. I just stepped aside and opened the door wider. Isabella was the first to enter with soft steps, and then she turned to look at me and whispered, "I missed your house, Grandma." Her little voice was so soft, but it warmed my soul. Edward put Nick on the living room sofa and suddenly collapsed to the floor, his face in his hands. He cried with that broken sob that has no pride or strength left, nothing of the man who once told me, "We're tired." I said nothing. I just guided Isabella and Nick to the room that used to be my living room. I had set up 2 small beds months ago, not because I knew they would come, but because I wanted the house to always be ready for them. I picked up Nick, laid him down, and with a wet wipe, I cleaned his hands and feet. He stirred a little, looked at me half asleep, and fell back asleep. Isabella sat next to him, hugging a plastic bag, as if it were a treasure, without taking her eyes off me. "Can we stay here?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Forever if we can, Grandma." I looked at her with her tangled hair and cheeks flushed from the cold. I stroked her head and said, You stay with me for as long as you want." Isabella smiled a faint but sincere little smile. I stood up, put a small blanket on Nick, and went back to the living room. Edward was still there, his head down. I poured him a glass of water, placed it in front of him without saying anything. I didn't want to comfort him nor scold him. I just wanted the children to be okay. I went to the room to see if Isabella had taken off her shoes. She was sitting on the bed taking an old doll out of the bag, the gift I had given her 2 years ago. "I've always taken care of her," she said, hugging the doll. I nodded, sat beside her, and felt a warmth inside me. I didn't need Edward to apologize, nor for Laura to come back. I just needed Isabella and Nick, these 2 children I've loved since they were born. That night I cooked a small pot of chicken soup, and the smell filled the house. Isabella helped me set the table, and Nick woke up babbling and pointing at things. Edward ate, but without looking up, without saying a word. When he finished, I walked him to the door and said, "You come back tomorrow, but tonight, find a place to sleep. I will take care of the children." Edward looked at me with red eyes, just nodded, and went out the gate. I closed the door and went back to see Isabella drawing something on a piece of paper. She looked at me and asked, "Are you mad at my dad?" I shook my head. "I'm not mad. I just want to do what's right for you." That night, I lay down on the sofa, listening to the soft breathing of Isabella and Nick in the room. I looked at the ceiling where the streetlight filtered through the curtain. A year ago, I thought I had lost everything. But now, with these 2 little ones in the house, I knew I had recovered a part of myself, not the mother or grandmother who gives everything without thinking, but Olivia, the one who learned to love well. I closed my eyes and smiled. I no longer expected anyone to return. I already had a home, and my home now had Isabella and Nick. The morning after Edward brought Isabella and Nick, I woke up early, even before the sunlight peeked through the curtains. The little house still smelled like chicken soup from the night before, and the sound of the children's peaceful breathing in the room gave me a strange sense of peace. I went to the kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast: corn cakes on the griddle, hot milk in a small pot, and some boiled eggs. I set the table with 2 extra small plates for Isabella and Nick. When the smell of toasted corn started to fill the house, Isabella poked her head out of the room, her hair messy and her eyes half closed from sleep. "Did you make corn cakes, Grandma?" she asked, all excited. I nodded with a smile. "Come and eat, sweetie, before they get cold." Edward emerged from the corner where he had slept on the sofa. He was thinner than I remembered, with an old t-shirt that was too big for him. He sat at the table, lowered his head, and ate in silence, chewing slowly, without saying a word. Isabella picked up Nick and put him in the high chair I had stored away long ago, then started feeding him his bottle. Watching that scene filled me with mixed feelings, warmth and sadness at the same time. I waited for Edward to finish eating, and then I spoke, my voice calm. "The children are going to stay here, but you need to find another place to live." Edward looked up, his eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Mom, I know I messed up," he muttered, "but I have nowhere to go right now." I cut him off firmly, but without harshness. "I've already forgiven you, but I can't go back to the way things were. This house isn't for adults who make mistakes and don't take responsibility for them." I took a small piece of paper from the drawer and wrote down the address of a job support and social reintegration center that Sister Helen from the House of Light had mentioned to me. I left the paper on the table in front of him. "You can start over," I said, "but not by hiding in your mother's arms." Isabella, who was still feeding Nick, overheard. She dropped the spoon, ran over, and grabbed her dad's hand, her voice trembling. "Where are you going, Dad? You need to stay too." Edward knelt down, hugged her tightly, his eyes red. The tears came out, one of those whimpers that no longer has any pride, no shadow of the man who once told me, "Stop meddling." I stood up and went out to the porch to give him his moment to say goodbye. The morning air hit my face cold, but it didn't bother me. I looked at the potted chrysanthemums and thought about the days when I believed I had to give everything to keep this family together. That same afternoon, Edward packed his things. He only took a broken backpack and an old cell phone. Before walking out the door, he turned, looked at me, and said, "I'm not going to ask you for anything anymore, but if you ever need me, I'll be back, this time to help you." I nodded without a word. I didn't cry, nor did I feel like I had won. I just felt a strange calm, as if I had finally let go of something I had been carrying for too long. When Edward left, I went back inside. Isabella was on the floor playing with the old doll I gave her. Nick was lying on the rug, babbling and pointing at a small plastic ball. I sat next to Isabella, stroking her hair. She looked up, placed her little hand on my knee, and asked, "Are we making Grandma sad?" I hugged her, feeling her warm little body. "No, sweetie," I said in a quiet voice. "With you two here, this house finally feels like a home." In the evening, I took the children to their room. I told Isabella a story about a little girl and a lost kitten, the same one I used to tell her when she was little. Isabella giggled softly, hugged her doll, and fell asleep. Nick, lying next to her, grabbed my finger with his tiny hand and closed his eyes. I sat there watching them, feeling that this house didn't feel so empty anymore. I stood up, turned off the light, but left a small lamp on in the corner, its yellow light softly illuminating their faces. The next morning I walked Isabella to school. She held my hand and happily skipped along the sidewalk. "Grandma, we get to draw in class today," she told me, her eyes shining brightly. I smiled and stroked her head. "Do a good job and bring it home for me to see." On the way back, I stopped by the House of Light, bringing a box of homemade cornbread to share. Helen met me at the door and asked, "Is it true you've taken in 2 children?" I nodded and briefly told her about Isabella and Nick. She smiled. "Mrs. Olivia, you didn't just save them, you also saved yourself." That afternoon, I returned home and prepared a pot of bean soup for dinner. Isabella helped me stir the spoon, and Nick, sitting in his chair, banged on it with a plastic spoon. I looked around the house and saw the card I had made for Isabella's birthday, still tucked away in a drawer. I took it out and gave it to her. "It's yours," I said. Isabella's eyes grew wide. She hugged the card and whispered, "I love you, Grandma." I smiled. I didn't need anything else. I know I've forgiven Edward, but forgiving doesn't mean going back to the way things were. I learned to set boundaries, not out of selfishness, but because I deserve to live with dignity. This house is now mine and the children's. Edward has to sort himself out just like I did. And for the first time, I felt that I wasn't just Isabella and Nick's grandmother, but Olivia, a woman who found herself again. 3 months after Isabella and Nick arrived, my little house was once again filled with the laughter of children. Every morning I wake up early, prepare a pot of hot tea, and make breakfast for the 2 of them. Isabella loves cornbread with jam, and Nick loves warm milk with a little bit of honey. I stand in the kitchen, listening to Isabella sing softly in her room, while Nick babbles and points at his toys on the rug. The house, once cold and quiet, is now full of life sounds and warmth. One day, Isabella ran out of her room with a crayon drawing. She held it up proudly. "Look, Grandma." In the drawing, I am in the middle wearing my usual sweater, Nick with a red ball on the left, and Isabella with her ponytail on the right. In a corner, she wrote "Grandma" in crooked but clear letters. I smiled, smoothed her hair, and said, "It's beautiful. Should we put it on the fridge?" Isabella nodded, went to get tape, and carefully stuck her drawing on the refrigerator door. Right next to it was the paper from the House of Light, the one that said, "My donation helped more than 20 women leave violent homes and start over." Seeing both things together, I felt a peace in my chest, as if I had finally found my place. Every day I walk Isabella to school. She holds my hand, skips along the sidewalk, and tells me about her friends and her teacher. "We learned to draw trees today, Grandma," she says, her eyes glowing. I nod and remind her to bring her drawing home. At home, I play with Nick, teaching him to talk. He's already starting to say "Grandma" in his shaky little voice, and it makes me laugh every time I hear it. In the afternoons, I cook with Isabella. She loves to stir the soup pot, and I teach her how to add just the right amount of salt. These moments, so simple, yet so warm, make me understand that a home isn't just a roof, it's where there is love. Edward sent letters from time to time. The first one arrived 2 weeks after he left. In crooked handwriting, he said he had gotten a job as a salesman at a hardware store. He didn't ask for money or beg for anything. He just wrote about his job and asked about Isabella and Nick. Once he wrote just one line. "I understand why you couldn't save me again. Thank you for continuing to save the children." I read the letter without crying, but something loosened in my chest. I found a photo of Isabella laughing on a park swing. I wrote a few lines back. "Be someone they will be proud to talk about." I sent it without expecting a reply. I just wanted Edward to know I was watching from a distance, in my own way. One spring morning, the sky was clear, and the sun bathed the street in front of the house. I made tea, sat at the table, and watched Isabella read a children's book while Nick played on the rug with a gray stray cat. The cat had shown up 2 months ago rail thin, but Isabella insisted on keeping him. Now he's plump and always curls up with Nick when he sleeps. I looked around the house. There are no luxuries. Some old chairs, the kitchen table with a broken corner, a few pots of chrysanthemums on the porch. But there is warmth enough to make it feel like a home, a real one. I stood up, opened the drawer, and took out the card I had made for Isabella's birthday. I had sent it to her on that day along with a small cake. Isabella hugged me and said, "You make the best cake." I laughed and thought that love doesn't have to be perfect, just sincere. The old family photo, me, Edward, Laura, and the kids, was replaced by a drawing made by Isabella. I no longer need that photo to remember what was. What remains is mine, and I will take care of it with all my clarity. That afternoon, I went to the House of Light with a box of cornbread to share. Helen greeted me with a smile. "Mrs. Olivia, they say your house is quite lively now." I nodded. I told her about Isabella and Nick, about the tiring but happy days. She handed me a new file for some women who had started their training. "You are an inspiration to them," she said. I shook my head and smiled. "I just do what I can." But as I left the center, I felt that I wasn't just helping them. I was also helping myself, rediscovering a strong Olivia who is no longer defined solely by invisible sacrifices. In the evening, I sat with Isabella and Nick in the living room. Isabella drew another picture this time with the gray cat. Nick crawled over, hugged my leg, and gave a toothless laugh. I picked him up and sang him a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me. Isabella yawned and leaned on my shoulder. "Grandma, I like it here," she whispered. I stroked her hair and said, "I like having you here too." That night I lay down on the sofa watching the streetlight filter through the curtain. I thought about what I lost, about all those years I gave without being seen. But I don't regret it. Now I have Isabel and Nick, and a life I built with my own hands. This house doesn't need perfect people, just people who still know how to love. And I, Olivia, learned to love well, not just my grandchildren, but also myself. Looking back, I understood that the greatest lesson was that loving doesn't mean sacrificing yourself blindly, but learning to love yourself so you can love others well. I spent my life giving, but when they made me invisible, I realized I had to set boundaries, not to push my family away, but to defend my own worth. The House of Light. Isabella and Nick taught me that a home is where love is nurtured, not where it is used or ignored. And I taught myself that it's never too late to take the path you choose, no matter how hard or painful it may be at first. The story we tell is fictional, but it is based on some real events. The names and places have been changed to protect the identity of those involved. We don't tell this to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to think. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? I am truly curious. If it were you in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to stay silent to keep the peace, or would you dare to face it all to reclaim your voice? I want to know what you think, because every story is a candle that can light someone else's path. God always blesses, and I firmly believe that courage leads us to better days. Meanwhile, on the end screen, I'm leaving you 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I assure you, they will surprise you. Thank you for staying until the end.